Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our June 2022 Compassion Chat. My name is Susan Marshall. I am the author of Mom's Gone Missing, When a Parent's Changing Life Upends Yours, and your host for our Compassion Chats. We meet the fourth Tuesday of every month at 6 p.m. Central right here on Zoom. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to get dressed up. Just come on in, bring a drink, bring your dinner. Join us for an informal chat with special guests that we bring in once a month and with each other. We really help each other as we share stories and experiences. So that's really what this effort is all about. We started it in March of last year. All of the archives are at susanamarshall.com. So go browse, see what we've already done. This session is being recorded. So I would ask those of you who are with us to please put yourself on mute. We will have a chat with Kirsten, and then we'll open up the conversation at the end for your questions, your comments, anything that you would like to share with the group. So this evening, I am absolutely delighted. We are so privileged to have as our guest Kerstin Kuentzel, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Kirsten is an advanced grief recovery specialist, and I know she has a lot of very interesting information for us this evening. Kirsten, welcome so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We love to start our chats getting to know a little bit about the individual who's joining us. So if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the work that you do as an advanced grief recovery specialist.
Oh man, my entire life led to this moment actually to become what I'm impersonating right now. And so I was born, raised, and educated in Germany, where I spent my first 28 years. And at the end of my teenage years, I started working in a bookstore. And there I came across a lot of literature that introduced alternative approach to healing, and one book in particular from an Austrian author really fascinated me. And the subtitle was What Symptoms Are Telling Us. And at the time, I was intrigued. I read about it, but I came back to this book ever since. So it has been one of my go-to things for a long time, maybe not so anymore, but for a long, long time, because even then, this doctor, who has by now published all over the world, is a well-known speaker, still works, and has his own practice. And it's unbelievable what he created overseas, But anyway, so that was my meager beginning in that direction. And then, of course, life took over and I fell into deep unconsciousness and forgetting. And so we moved from Germany to Italy, where we spent 6 years, and from Italy to the United States, where I have lived in Wisconsin since 95.
Welcome.
For a long time. Yeah. And here I had my only child, who is 22 now, and she now moved back to Germany, where she's actually get an oncology degree. So
wow, that's awesome.
But coming back to why I'm here is in my mid-40s, I had a tick bite and I went to the doctor, and the doctor didn't believe me that it was a tick bite because the bullseye effect seemed to her like shingles. So I got treated accordingly and I got bedridden really badly. So I went back to see another doctor, and it was very messy. At the time, Lyme's disease wasn't as well known as it is now, and that was 2007. But luckily, through connections, I came across a medical doctor who also was specializing in Lyme's disease. That was his field. And I got the proper treatment and then the proper supplements to restore everything in my body that the antibiotics had killed, And so it took me about 2 years to really come to terms with this. However, this particular doctor, he said something to me, and he said, well, you need to become proactive and you need to change your perspective. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. But I started, so this particular book from that bookstore came back into mind. And of course, Lyme's disease wasn't mentioned in there, but, certain other symptoms that are part of the Lyme's occurrences, And so anyway, I looked around and I took classes here and there, and pretty fast, I was drawn to Reiki. And I was lucky enough to come right to the source, the first female Reiki master in Wisconsin. And I became first a client of hers. And then pretty soon I heard from her what I had heard from the naturopath. You need to change your perspective on your disease. And I thought, And so she said, let me work with you in a different way. Because at the time, she also had a little institute, and it was called the Institute of Self-Awareness, where a number of people came together twice a month. And she was introducing higher consciousness readings to them from big names like Deepak Chopra, Wayne Dyer, Eckhart Tolle, and so on. Names I hadn't heard at that time at all, or just randomly, And so so she prepared me to become part of that group. And one sunny day, I was introduced to that group. And ever since, I had been a member of it until she died a couple of years back. So during all these years, since 2000, I started 2007 with her, and her death, I think it was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, until her death, I was part of that group, and we met regularly, and had these readings. I was part of her Reiki group, of course, because of course I got eventually my first, my second, and my third degree, and it became just a way of being. And especially the teachings of Eckhart Tolle at first resonated with me, and his approach to inner stillness, and also his analogy with nature, because nature was my church from early childhood on, and my family's. And so I could relate to that very well. And so that led to a pretty peaceful place for a while, until my mom's cancer journey got really dicey. And she asked me if I could be there during her last week. And I have to say, thanks to all these teachings and the inner work I had done, it helped me to stay present and be there. Because deep down, I wanted to be there for her, but not necessarily for my dad. Because my dad and we have had a very troubled relationship, to put it mildly. And so he was the nemesis of my rebellious years and beyond, because I never outgrew really my belief system about him, for a long time. So when my mom died, I wasn't at that point yet, but I could be there for him as she wanted me to. And so something actually magically happened, because my mom and dad, they were like Siamese twins. And when she passed on, my dad fell apart. And I suddenly had to step up and do things I wasn't even prepared to do. And somehow I had the strength to do it. And I could assist my dad, which was pretty amazing. And so that was the first turn in our relationship, because suddenly he looked towards me for answers, and he said, "How can you do this?" And well, it was hard to explain, but that was my first time that I thought, oh my God, I wish I could find something to help somebody who is so grief-stricken and cannot see beyond that. Yeah. And even things that were the center of my dad's life, classical music, arts, birds, were not on his spectrum at all, and it was just not important. All evolved around my mom has passed, and now I don't have any purpose on living. So that was really tricky for me, because I tried everything to be there for him, and my parents live overseas, so it wasn't that I just had to go next door and be there, so I stayed with him quite a while. And that went well for a couple of years. My dad actually published his last book about classical music 1 year before he was officially diagnosed with dementia. And it was a long story, but anyway, my dad had some vertigo attacks, and one of which ended him in the hospital. And then they wanted to release him again, and they called me and say, well, we can't release him home. You need to be there for him, because there is no other one in my family. I'm it, At that time, my daughter was not an adult. She lived still here with us. So I was the end of the line. So of course, I felt it was my duty to step up. And so I flew over with the intention to nurse him back to health. Well, little did I know that I received a demented patient at home. And nobody wanted to believe that it was dementia. That was the funny part. And yet I knew my dad well enough that I knew something was off. And to make a long story short, I tried to nurse him back to health for a couple of weeks, and then certain physical symptoms didn't dissipate, including incontinence. So it was quite a struggle, and I was on my own, and I was at my end's width, and whatever.
Right. That's how it goes.
So,
to the wit's
yeah.
end, it becomes an end's width.
Yeah. So I said, well, Dad, temporarily I would place you into a retirement setting where people can take better care of you while I try to find a good housing situation for you. Because he was still living in a 2-story home full of furniture and all his belongings like Mom had left them, so yeah. And so while I was taking care of this undertaking, I also had to find a home out of zero availability from one moment to the next. But I was very lucky, and I hardly slept during those weeks. And I finally was lucky enough to find an open space he could move in while I was trying to reduce his belongings and find better suitable housing when he would come back. During that time, he had another fall. He ended in the hospital. He ran away from the hospital, and he walked away a couple of times. And then finally the red flags came up that there is more and he might need some medical placement, psychological placement, and they finally put the label dementia on him. And that gave me permission to place him in a protected retirement home, which was not possible in that first one because it wasn't that way. So I needed to find a new place for him. Well, somebody up there moved some balls for me. I don't know from where that came, but I found one by miracle. And so he ended up there. Long story short, so my dad, from the time he was diagnosed till his death last year, it was 4.5 years of slow decline. And I visited him as often as I could, up to three times a year, which doesn't seem much, but it is a lot if you travel between United States and here while I maintain my family and my sanity here again, you know. And whenever I visited, I really wanted to be there for him. And for me, it was relatively easy because I kept up with my rituals and my readings and listening to proper podcasts that build a caregiver up, you know. And I was doing what I needed to do to be there for him when I was there and be there present. And unfortunately, I saw a lot of other family members from other patients in that setting that didn't know what to do with their loved ones. They wanted to be there, but they didn't know how to. They either treated them as children or as non-existing and chatted with the nurse while the loved one was sitting there. And, you know, so I just became really upset. There should be something out there. There must be something out there. And I continued to search here and there. And eventually I came across the grief recovery method and I was just sucked into it. So first I had to try it on my own and I wanted to try it and I did. And it had a remarkable effect on me because I made some discoveries that I had no clue about I might come across. So my whole belief system tumbled. It wasn't the grief recovery method by itself. There were other things, like I learned a lot about epigenetics. There was the first ever grandchildren of World War II meeting in Germany. It was an online setting where a lot of alternative doctors and psychologists presented to my generation, who is a direct descendant of war children, you know, because both of my parents have seen World War II live, you know, and were in the midst of it during their teenage years. So yeah, anyway, so a lot of things came together, but I liked the approach of grief recovery because it allowed me to, it forced me to become really honest with myself and to express certain happenings and communication that I hadn't felt free to deliver to anybody, and certain things to share, certain things I hadn't shared before, you know.
Kirsten, if I could pause you there, because
Yes.
so much of what you've said, certainly related to your dad, is so relevant to this group of caregivers who joins us for Compassion Chats. The confusion, I think the first sense of dementia or Alzheimer's and the first manifestation, I think our normal natural reaction is denial. Oh, it's not that bad, or oh, it's not he's just getting old. You mentioned the fall. How did you just yourself come to terms with this is bigger than just the physical decline that you had seen? You said your dad was a brilliant man and obviously so engaged in so many different things. Tough relationship. You and I have spoken previously, and of course in my book I write about my mother. Did not like her, right? And yet you have to get to a place when it is your responsibility to take care as best you can. How did you come to terms with that? And is that a major factor in what led you ultimately to the grief recovery method?
Yes. So the denial part was not really there, because actually the year before he was declared that officially he was declared demented, there were some signs, and I thought it was just typical dad crossing the boundaries one more time. Yeah. And I put steps into place so that he couldn't overstep. We talk about financial stuff and on my account. And so I was furious, because I thought that was just typical dad, I mean, he had this overpowering personality. And especially when it came to his immediate family, boundaries didn't exist for him, And so I didn't pay too much attention, but I cornered him at one point that summer. And I said, what's the explanation behind this? Can you explain this to me? And he became so defensive and he said, oh, I don't remember. And I said, I don't buy this. Of course you do remember, and I got really mad with him. And then I just let it fall, because I didn't want to spoil our summer with my dad, so I just dropped it, put the steps in place and walked away. And then I received some phone calls from him during the following years that made me think back to this incident. And I thought something is off, but I can't put my finger on it. And then, but my dad lived very withdrawn, and he could play really well the role he played. I think it becomes the ultimate role a so-called demented person plays, to hide as long as possible what is happening.
I think that's true. And I think the other aspect of it is the one that you mentioned where he got very defensive.
Right. That
many of us as caregivers deal with that too and don't really know how. There's conflicting advice, don't argue. And what I was taught by a chaplain, a hospice chaplain, was go where they are. Engage them in the conversation that they need. This is a very different aspect of that you're describing, financial affairs, right? And certainly has it impinged on yours.
Right.
And yet you continued to work through that. Now you had a heck of a distance.
Yes.
It's in Germany.
And actually there were not many signs except these strange vertigo spills. And I had conversations with his family doctor who had seen him for 30 years. It was somebody who lives close by, is my age, very informed in elderly care and all this. And so he hadn't seen any clues. So when I officially had my dad declared demented, he was the first one in my face. And he said, really? I would have seen this. He didn't, because my dad was just simply tired, or, he had a long trip behind him or whatnot. There was always an excuse. So people didn't notice. And I was too far away to notice, only when I was living with him after he had come back from the hospital, then I noticed there is more to it than just yeah, you have a bad concussion, but there is more to this concussion and some physical symptoms. Something is off, and one big red flag was right there again. He didn't want me at all to take care of his bills. And I said, Dad, you have to grant me access because somebody needs to pay these bills. You have been in the hospital for so long and so on. So finally, when I saw what was going on in his paperwork, then it was pretty clear what was going on.
And then
at that time, it was pure compassion. I just felt, I was actually bawling when I found out what was going on, because I thought here I was the year before berating somebody who's actually sick, and did that not on purpose,
Right.
And so that was where really I could pull all the compassion plugs, and I was just, and that, yes, it was really tough being there, but at the same time, I had so much compassion for him, and
so given that, so you're
yes.
there, you see, you're naturally impelled to help him. Compassion, obviously, is a word that we use here a lot. Where were you, Kerstin, on your learning journey with the advanced grief recovery method? Was it?
I hadn't touched it yet.
Oh, so
I hadn't encountered it whatsoever yet.
So what drew you? What was kind of the catalyst? Because one of the things I've been thinking a lot about your work and our conversation this week, this as a caregiver, we think we can do it all. And then, we do our best, and sometimes it's good, sometimes not. We get more and more exhausted as the days and weeks and months go by.
Correct.
We feel terribly inadequate. Are those, and many, many other sort of symptoms, are those expressions of grief? Or are those simply manifestations of exhaustion? And what led you to explore grief as something in terms of healing?
I think I have been grieving all my life, and I knew it.
You knew it.
I knew it. Yeah. I was aware of it. I think even during my 20s, we have had, I was born into this big happy family, but these were all adults, and one by one they died, and they didn't have kids. I don't have cousins. I don't have second cousins. I don't have third cousins. I have fourth cousins that I never met, who lived behind the Iron Curtain when I was growing up. Other third cousins that I have seen once because they lived at the other end of Germany. So, all the family I grew up with and I have known was going. And so there was, at a certain point, there was one after another that was just gone, And so grief was a constant in my life, I have to say. And I know that my dad was grieving his past and what happened to his family, and my mom on her end, And there were open conversations even about it within the family,
What was the catalyst, Kerstin, that made you say, I've got to do something about this?
The helplessness I felt.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's common with caregivers, certainly with dementia and Alzheimer's patients. We don't know what to do.
Right.
That became a real burden for you, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, but at the same time, it intrigued me to step beyond what I thought I could do, And so that helping my dad through this whole long journey, from one of the most eloquent people I have ever met, to somebody who hasn't responded 18 months before, and well, he was probably in 2020 during COVID, he stopped talking. But yet I had twice a week my half-hour conversations with him. And I was talking to myself, but I picked topics that I thought might bring joy to him or might spark some interest in him, like I knew his hobbies, and and so I did my best as far as I could. I shared what was going on our end, but not the heavy stuff. But I didn't lie to him either, So I told him why the masks have to be and how silly that sometimes looks.
That was a challenge, I think, for many of us, right?
Yeah. But anyway, so it was all good. And I kept that up during these 1.5 years where there was almost no conversation going on, because it was a one-way street, this conversation. But I kept it up, and I actually was looking forward to it, and I could, in the end, I could only read from his eyes and if he was present or not, or if he was mildly interested or not,
So again, I'm curious how that work led you to grief recovery and the healing that goes with that. Because I know when I wrote in my book, I had 2 years after mom passed, I'm like, just like your dad, what am I supposed to do now? That had been my job, first for dad and then for mom. You had a long journey, first with your mom and then with your dad. How did you then decide that this was something you wanted not only to explore, but actually get trained to do to help others? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, before I came to the grief recovery method, I was really into getting grounded and being there for my opposite, and I have seen that people avoid often unpleasant situations, and I had to face my opponent, my biggest opponent in my life. And then when I went through the grief recovery training, the person I had put on the pedestal, my mom, suddenly crumbled somewhat and came level to level with my dad. And I thought, well, then the next person I have to look into it will be my dad. And I did, and I discovered things about my belief system. And that's where it really came down to, that for way too many decades, I had kept up my strong belief system of who my parents were when I was a teenager, and not seeing that they have changed as much as I have changed in a different direction too, but anyway, they had changed. And I saw that first little change in my dad, as I said, when my mom died, and I really saw his human devastation. And then again, when his dementia showed up, I could relate to how hard it must be for him to be in this prison, because there is this struggle. They want to communicate with us, but they can't, and not in the usual form. And so I felt, it was unbelievable. And I had to work my way through the grief recovery process through my major caretakers, and that was also my maternal grandmother and the governess of my mom, who was like the third grandmother, to come to that realization that, wow, it's this thing can really move you it can take burdens off of you, and I could express things I wasn't able to express towards my parents. So doing the grief recovery method, I had to spill certain things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been true to myself, and I did, and it came easy. Yeah. Because it was just me and the piece of paper, and then the person across from me who I finally read the letter to, Yeah. And then eventually the universe who would pick the energy of these undelivered messages up.
Yes, I speak often about the griefs and the gifts of dementia and Alzheimer's. The grief, everybody knows, right? And it's so difficult. And losing an individual a little bit at a time while they're still with us physically, it's that feeling we talked about earlier, so helpless, so inadequate. You don't really know what to do. And that's the grief part of it. But the gift is, as you're describing so beautifully, I think, Kerstin, is beginning to understand yourself in the context of your family and beginning to really look at, as an adult, even if you're a child of the patient, the Alzheimer's or dementia person, you can come to terms with things as they are as an adult and recognize. And you know what you said about bringing your mom down off a pedestal, flip that. I had the same with my dad. And I didn't like my mom, just like you didn't have a great relationship with your dad, but that all evens out. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can get to the point of accepting that this is what is happening and that we are all doing the best that we can while you discover things and write them down, I think that's the powerful piece. Now, you mentioned you read it to someone else. Is that kind of the closure piece of the grief?
That's the final step. Yes. But there are crucial steps. First, it's really that you learn about all the myths we take on and the conditioning we take on from the people we grow up with, the adults we look up to, and not that they have to necessarily tell us certain things, but we just see them, how they react in a case of loss. And so we think, oh, that's how we need to react. That's what I did. I got busy. I distracted myself. I became strong for my dad. Yeah. Even if I was grieving myself, I had no time for my grief. I needed to be strong for him. Well, too bad. My grief caught up with me pretty fast, but, I found luckily the tools to deal with it.
Well, and I think that what you just said there is so, so powerful because it's so universal, it seems. Caregivers, I don't have time for me. I'll do that later. I'm fine. I need to be strong for, I need to take care of, yada, yada, yada. And then at some point, you just realize you're out of gas.
Yes.
Right? And so the journaling is part of the grief recovery method. I don't necessarily want you to talk us through that whole process, but what are some of the key things that you learned that we as caregivers and in this community can consider and actually begin to reflect on? We'll share how people can reach you, kind of at the end of this, but what are some of the key things that you did that you found to be most helpful?
With the grief recovery method, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you learn a lot about taking care of yourself first, because if you distract yourself with alcohol or with cigarettes or with too much social media or TV, you don't take care of yourself, So whatever is important for you, whatever builds you up, do that first, even if it's just 10 minutes. 10 minutes, get up 10 minutes earlier and do what builds you up so that you can face that day anew, with your loved one. And at the end of the day, look back, possibly write out what was aggravating or heavy, that this is out of your system before you go to bed, and close your day with gratitude for what was right, for what was beautiful, what was unique, you know. That is not necessarily grief recovery method, but that helped me through the thick stuff, you know. And so the beauty of the grief recovery method is really, it says when we are born, we are like a flower bed with rich soil and lots of unique seeds in it. And thanks to conditioning and schooling and whatnot, the plants grow, and so do the weeds and the invasive species. And of course, weeds and invasive species, if they are not removed, they take over and overshadow the uniqueness of that flower bed. So if we take regularly care of our flower bed, our internal flower bed, and do something to help us get centered, get grounded before we face the patient or our loved one or whoever it is, then we can come from a more helpful place.
I love the way you describe that, Kirsten. And I'm just sitting here thinking, boy, I know that I got a lot of weeds in my garden.
We all do.
And I suspect many of us do. And it's kind of like, okay, how do I start my weeding, whether it's daily or weekly? That's a really neat picture. I like, it's easy to picture, right? It's easy to imagine that.
Yeah.
And then to work on that. I want to go to that last step of reading, and then I want to open it up for questions. That last part of it, you said you read out aloud. What is it that you read?
Well, I'm not supposed to give that all away, but it's bad. It's the grief recovery method is you take certain steps, and at the very end, so you work on one relationship at a time, not more, you know. And the process leads you to which relationship you want to pick. It's your choice. It all is your choice, you know. Yep. And how deep you want to go, all is your choice. But then you read a closure letter to that particular person.
Okay.
Where you can go into apologies, you go into forgiveness, and you make strong emotional statements.
So that
could be anything from "I love you" and "thank you so much" to something less pleasant, you know. But all three parts are part of, or can be part of that letter, have to be part of that letter.
It sounds like a wonderful closure. If that relationship, you've resolved the things that have brought you grief. And I can imagine it gives you a tremendous sense of peace.
Yes, it does. And it's not done and over with necessarily, you know, but there is another process you can continue to weed because there might be some occurrences in your life and suddenly a memory pops up and you think, oh, I still have to do something about this memory, you know, but then you have the tools how to address that. And it's beautiful. It's an ongoing process. So you are never completely done. But you get much lighter, let's say like this.
I like that a lot. And you just get less weedy. I like to get rid of these weeds, right? So I want to open it up for questions. If anybody has a question or a comment, Lucia, I know the difficult personality is something that you probably can relate to in the situation that you've kind of endured. I wonder what your perspective is, or if you have a question or just been there, done that.
I do have a question. I do understand strong personalities. My question was, you're an advanced
grief recovery specialist.
Yeah. And I was wondering, and I can't remember if I picked this up from one of the last sessions or somewhere else. There's complex grief as opposed to just regular old vanilla grief. I was wondering if you could speak to that at all, like those.
Okay, so
Okay.
I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a
Okay.
psychiatrist. I
Okay.
have no background in that field except the little reading I have done, and you know, so I'm not a therapist, not a counselor,
Right.
social worker. So I'm just anybody
Kind of
from the street, basically.
a
So,
guide.
but yes, a
You have
guide.
the roadmap, and you're like, this is
Yes,
a
the
great way to go.
facilitator of this particular program. And the Grief Recovery Institute does not make a difference between what kind of grief it is.
Okay.
So we just, any type of loss, and it doesn't have to be a loss of health or death, you know, it can be any kind of loss, can be addressed through this method, because the steps will always be the same.
Okay.
And so they differentiate between 40, I think 44 different losses. So, you know, so grief is just the umbrella word for all of this, you know.
Well, you know, Kirsten, you and I talked last week, and I think it's not just loss, right? It's any big change.
It's any change, correct. It's any change or a change or end to a pattern of behavior as well. So for example, if your child graduates from elementary school, that's a change, you know, and it can have a huge impact on your child as well as on the parent too, because you accompany your child through this. So that might not be the biggest thing, but it could be also a change in health, of course, absolutely. But you know, it could be a change in profession, you know, that brings off a whole different array of people out of your, I mean, that you are not close to anymore, and suddenly you face new people and a whole new different boss and workplace, you know, or you move, you know, that's moving can have a huge effect on life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it sounds like a means of adapting to things that perhaps sometimes we would rather not.
right. So acceptance is the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and Lucia, just the conversations we have had, the difficult personality that you deal with is seems to be that.
Personalities.
Okay, well, but it sounds like the adaptation, any change of behavior needs to come from you to help them be, right? Okay.
Who they want to be.
Well, right.
Which luckily is my superpower, but that said, we all have our limits.
Correct.
No, I was just curious, and the reason I asked it is because I know some folks, and thankfully not me at this point in my life, but like just the layers upon layers upon, like when it starts just becoming multiple changes and multiple losses and like how does one even begin to pick through that when you're trying to deal with so many things at once? And that's where I was kind of like intrigued.
You start with one first, you know,
right.
and see, and not usually we encourage, especially if people do the training, you are encouraged not to start with your most difficult person. So that's why I picked my easiest person, which was supposed to be my mom, only to find out that, well, that was a shot in the foot. So, yeah. But actually it was a really convincing point to me that there is something wrong with how I look at things versus, oh, the method is wrong, you know. I could luckily see, I was not deterred by it, you know. Other people might have said, okay, I don't want to go this way, you know, but I think I knew enough about myself and having lied to myself for a while, that I was willing to go there and say, okay, there must be more to it. So let's try another person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I just, it just resonated with me. That's all I can say, you know, and there are different things for different people. We all are different, luckily, you know, so that it doesn't get boring.
Right.
But for me, the grief recovery method came to the right time, because opposite to you, Susan, I was still able to tell my dad in person, I am so sorry for what I have done to you and my mom. And please go and tell her, as if she wouldn't hear it, you know. So that I was so blind for so many years, you know, and couldn't see, couldn't hear, but I'm hearing now, and I'm so sorry that it had to come to that point, you know.
You know, that's an interesting point. I think our tendency is to do what you said earlier, be distracted, stay busy. You know, I'm okay, I'll just keep going on.
Yeah.
And having either getting to the point of being so exhausted, you need to do something different, or having the courage to say, you know what, I got to figure this out. Are those kind of the opposite end of the spectrum that you see when people come to actually have the help of the system or the method?
They usually reach out to us when they are really at a low point, you know, and when they hear that we are just listening boards and we don't judge, we don't criticize, we don't analyze. They are so afraid of being analyzed all the time, you know, and that we are basically just big heart with ears, and we are just the sounding board of their own voice, of their own writing, you know, nothing else. And that's it. So basically they can have this conversation with themselves, basically, and we just make sure they stay with the steps. That's all.
I love it. So you've given us two pictures. One is a garden with too many weeds, but beautiful flowers. And the second one you just gave is a big heart with ears.
Yes, absolutely.
That's wonderful. Well, does anybody else have a comment, a question, anything for Kerstin? Otherwise, we will wrap. Kerstin, where can we find you? And where can we find your work? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, the best way, you can find me, of course, under, you find me on Facebook and you find me on LinkedIn under Anja Kerstin Kuentzel. And maybe you could reach out to Susan. I can provide the information through Susan if you want to. And that would be a possibility too, you know.
What I can do, Kerstin, is following the chat, I usually post just a thank you for being with us, for more information. So if you could send that to me, I would include that in my Facebook and LinkedIn post about this chat this evening. We will also put it on the Susan A. Marshall website. That will, in the chat. Yeah.
I just said it just to you, just in case I wasn't sure.
Yeah, put a chat. Grief recovery method. Yeah. Did you post that, Lucia?
I did, just to you though. I wasn't sure if you.
Sure, share it.
Okay. Hold on, everyone.
There we go.
Did you have that with my name on it?
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Well, you are on top of things.
You know what? This is what we want, technology savvy people. This one is not.
Yeah, here neither. Just randomly.
That's fabulous. Thank
I
you.
need to hire Josh too.
No kidding. Jim, it's wonderful to see you. Do you have a question or anything you want to comment before we close up today? No? Okay. Thanks for being with us. Well, that wraps it for this evening. Kerstin, is there one last word or bit of advice, bit of encouragement you'd like to offer us before we close our chat this evening?
Bit of advice, reach out when you there is nobody, there is always somebody. Reach out, find help, whatever you need, and try to build yourself up first before you face your day with your loved one or client.
Wonderful.
And
Wonderful words.
stop with gratitude.
Yes, absolutely. And think of yourself as a big heart with ears. That is wonderful. Kirsten, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
To so many. Thank you, those of us who joined us. Welcome and enjoy. For those of you who will find Kirsten in our archives, again, SusanAMarshall.com is where you will find this chat and all of the ones we've done since March of 2021. So we've been at this for a year. Kirsten, you are a gift to all of us. Thank you so much.
Oh, God. You as well. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.